All right, hello IB people. We are back with another video in this lecture series about the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong. Today we're going to be looking at the first and second five-year plans, and the second five-year plan has a special name. It's called the Great Leap Forward. We're going to enjoy plenty of awesome propaganda posters like this one here, and as time goes on, you're going to see the propaganda posters in Mao's China get increasingly unhinged. In this one here, we have a group of people that are flying or walking across a body of water, and in the background is a man flying on a rocket. Referring to the IB history syllabus, we are on section 14, and what we're talking about today is this bullet point here, transition to socialism, first and second five-year plans, and we're going to talk about the 100 Flowers campaign. So first, I'd like to establish what is a five-year plan. The idea comes from the Soviet Union, and you can see here a Soviet poster promoting five-year plans. And translated, the poster says 2 plus 2 plus the enthusiasm of the worker equals 5. The idea behind these plans is an underdeveloped nation could use the government control and rally the masses of the people in order to develop their industry faster than would be possible under normal circumstances. The way that it works is that the central government would set targets to develop heavy industry and send out advisors and Communist Party cadres to organize the citizenry in this work. The people are organized onto government controlled living and work facilities, and the citizens will attempt to meet or exceed those targets set by the government. When 5 years go by, then the government will evaluate their progress and then set new targets. Now, all of this talk about developing industry may come off as not communist. So, how does this square with communist ideology? The idea of a communist government taking control of the economy and directing it in a certain direction. Well, the origin behind this is Karl Marx felt that societies go through 6 different stages. And before arriving at a perfect communist utopia where everyone is exactly equal and there is no need for government, there's a step before that, and it's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. And in this phase, it is okay for people who desire to have communist utopia, it's okay for them to organize and have a strong centralized government that redistributes resources and tells people what to do and when to do it, because it's working toward a communist paradise. Now, Joseph Stalin built upon the ideas of Karl Marx, and he argued that, furthermore, something like a 5-year plan would be beneficial because it would allow an underdeveloped communist country to quickly gain parity with highly developed capitalist countries. And that was important because for communist survival in the world, communist countries would have to be technologically on par with capitalist countries, otherwise they would be defeated. So that's the rationale for why these 5-year plans were implemented. And as an aside, I'd like to point out that to this day, the People's Republic of China still uses 5-year plans. You can see here, this is the 5-year plan that they're in currently, and they have moved far beyond a focus on heavy industry, and now they are interested in scientific development, they're interested in unemployment rates, the urban population, life expectancy, green development. So I've been using this term heavy industry, and let's define that. Heavy industry are industries that are very expensive to set up, industries that use large, expensive machinery and produce very large and heavy products that are difficult to transport, such as coal mining industry, the steel industry, shipbuilding, automobile manufacturing, chemical plants, oil extraction and refining. So a question for you, Why would an underdeveloped country prioritize developing heavy industry as their top priority in the beginning? I'll show you the answer in 3, 2, 1. Think of heavy industry as like the building blocks for all other kinds of economic and commercial development. So if a country wants to become a fully modernized nation where they're able to manufacture radios and consumer products like hair dryers and nice clothing and other maybe luxury goods, well, you got to start with the basics. You have to have concrete and steel and fertilizer and oil before you can have any of those other nice things. So these two propaganda posters here are illustrating how, in this case, electricity is going to be used to provide many different things to the people. It will power industrial plants. It can be used to power telephones and radios. It can power a fan inside an apartment, and it can power electric buses. Over here, we have steel. Steel can be used for trains and ships. It can be used for artillery and tanks. It can be used for farming equipment, as well as it looks like metal structures like for building things. Here is a map of all of the different major building projects in China during the first 5-year plan. I wanted to show you this map to show you that it was a very ambitious plan, and they had a lot of enormous building projects planned across the country. This all goes back to that idea of 2 + 2 = 5. You have a highly centralized state, you mobilize all of the people, and you set them to work on these enormous and ambitious projects in order to fast forward the development of your country. It's like taking a YouTube video and putting it on 1.5 speed, or listening to an audiobook or a podcast on double speed. A few visuals to show you some of the kind of projects they did. Up here in the top left, we have a steel plant that was started by the Japanese, but then the Chinese took it over and expanded it. In the upper right-hand corner, we have a bridge, a concrete and steel bridge that spans the Yangtze River. This is a modern photograph. It still exists, and it has it's very Soviet in its architectural style, and there are some socialist, realist carvings on the bridge. Then down here we have a railroad that was developed, which had there was a part of the railroad had existed prior to the communists taking over, but previous attempts to build this railroad fell short, and only when the P.R.C. came to power were they able to finally complete this railroad. And one more example, First Automotive Works was established as part of the first 5-year plan, and they were producing China's first domestically made trucks. The top image is the Chinese truck, and the bottom image is a Soviet truck. So you can see the connection here to the Soviet Union. The Soviets were providing their blueprints. They were providing their experts as part of that Sino-Soviet treaty. And that's what made this kind of stuff possible. First Automotive Works still exists. It's one of China's major automobile manufacturers. Now, in order for these 5-year plans to work, the Communist Party of China organized its citizens into work units, which are called danwei. So what I'd like you to do here is I'd like you to pause the video, and I'd like you to study this diagram that's giving you a top-down view of a danwei. This is a compound for the Beijing No. 2 textile factory. So I'd like you to give it a close look and see what all of the different facilities are so that you can answer the question, why did the P.R.C. organize citizens into danwei? Give a look, and I'll give you my answer in 3, 2, 1. It made sense to organize people into work units for a few reasons, a couple things you might have said. The communists are promising to spread the wealth and, spread opportunity for all people. China is very underdeveloped. So if you take the population and you concentrate them into these work units, then you can build, if you just build a couple schools and a couple medical facilities, then you can suddenly provide medical care and education and recreation for large numbers of people, because you've taken the people and you've concentrated them into these work units where a wide variety of different services and facilities can be offered to them. If we look at this, though, in a more negative light, or a more, think about this in a more critical way, a more nefarious way, it's also an opportunity for an authoritarian state to have tremendous control over their population. So you can see this as being something that was nice, but also there's an ulterior motive here for organizing people into the Dan way. Another exercise for you to do. Here are some different heavy industries that were the targets of the first 5-year plan. In this column, we have the data from 1952 about how much was being produced in the P.R.C. Here's what the first 5-year plan wanted to produce by the end of 5 years. And then the third column here with numbers in it is what they actually were able to produce. What I'd like you to do is I would like you to look through these numbers, and I'd like you to identify whether they fell short of their target, they met their target, or they exceeded their target. And this way we can get a sense of how did the first 5-year plan do. Pause here, and then I'll give you the answer in 3, 2, 1. So what I'd like to illustrate here is that even though in some categories they fell short, the P.R.C. still increased their output of these heavy industries by leaps and bounds. Even if we look at locomotives, so train engines, they had produced 20 of them in 1952. They wanted to produce 200 of them by 1957. They fell short, but they're producing 167 locomotives, as before they were only producing 20. So the first 5-year plan was, by most metrics, a tremendous success. Chinese industries grew by leaps and bounds. Now, all of these steel plants and coal mines and oil derricks that were popping up all over the country, they needed workers. In turn, those workers needed to be fed and housed. So the way that these 5-year plans worked was that the state would purchase grain from the peasantry and ship it out to the oil derricks, the coal mines, the steel plants, and the urban centers where all of this heavy industry work was being done. So in the first 5-year plan, peasants sold more than a quarter of their grain to the state at very low prices set by the government. That grain was used to guarantee a food supply in these manufacturing areas and urban areas. But this led to grain shortages in rural areas. The P.R.C. started experimenting with having farmers keep the private land that they had been given through land reform, but they started encouraging them to work together in cooperatives. And the way this worked is that the farmers would keep their private land, but they would share agricultural equipment, and they would collectively purchase seeds and fertilizer as a means of pooling their resources to try to increase their efficiency. So if you take a look at this diagram here, over the course of the first 5-year plan, you can see that the farmers are going from privately running their own farms to these cooperative farms that are getting larger and larger in scale, so that by 1957, the vast majority of farmers are organized onto these large cooperatives that are being overseen by the state. And again, the way that the government is pitching this is that if Chinese peasantry work together and share their labor and the limited equipment that they have, they're going to get bigger yields, better results. During this time, farmers were pretty productive. In my favorite documentary series, China Century of Revolution, there's a couple of farmers that get interviewed, and they talked about how having their own private land and then working on these voluntary cooperatives really gave them the opportunity to produce enough for their families and a little extra that they could sell and begin to really improve their lives. However, this kind of free market economic activity was disturbing to Mao because it was creating a new class system which he was trying to eliminate. As the first 5-year plan was winding down and the country was preparing to move on to the second 5-year plan, Mao took the opportunity to call for 100 flowers to bloom and 100 schools of thought to contend. This is the 100 Flowers campaign. The inspiration for that quote, or I should say, the origin of that quote, is from classical Chinese literature. And the idea behind it is that a lot of different scholars and schools of thought will share their different ideas about how the country should move forward, and the best ideas will prevail in the end. Mao Zedong invited people to offer constructive criticism by dropping feedback off in little boxes, by publishing open letters, or by making posters to hang on walls. This photograph here might be from a later campaign, but I'm using the photograph here to illustrate what these public message boards looked like back in the day. At first, people were very shy. They were timid. Did not want to come out and openly criticize the government. But in February of 1957, Mao gave a speech where he further encouraged people to criticize, and eventually a torrent of criticism came in, some of it directed at Mao himself, and Mao was astonished. Not only were complaints being submitted privately through the little letter boxes or through private letters, but people were plastering these giant posters on what they were calling democracy walls, like the wall I showed you on the previous page. And some of these critiques were even questioning Mao's leadership. So just a few months after he started this 100 Flowers campaign, he does a complete 180 and he initiates what was called an anti-rightist campaign. And the official that he puts in charge of this is Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping is going to be a major figure in this story going forward. So I want you to know his name, similar to Peng Dehuai during the Korean War. According to government statistics, about 500,000 people are persecuted for having spoken out. They are publicly criticized in these public struggle sessions, and a number of them are sent to re-education camps. Some of them are killed. Now, the scholarly community has been divided about Mao's purpose with the 100 Flowers campaign. There are plenty of academics that are convinced that Mao Zedong knew all along that he was going to do a 180. And their view is reflected here by Mao Zedong's personal physician, Dr. Li Zhisui. Dr. Li Zhisui left China, came to the US, and wrote a tell-all autobiography that was with the help of a ghostwriter. In his book, The Private Life of Chairman Mao, Dr. Li Zhisui said, quote, he was quoting Mao. So according to Dr. Li Zhisui, Mao said, "We want to coax the snakes out of their holes," Mao told me around this time, "then we will strike. My strategy is to let the poisonous weeds grow first, then destroy them one by one." So the idea there is that Mao knew all along that he was going to use the 100 Flowers campaign to get critics and dissenters to speak their mind so that he could round them up and crush them. Now, while there are plenty of scholars that feel that is true, there's others in the academic community that feel Mao did not have such evil or nefarious goals. And one of them is Jonathan Spence, the author of our textbook, The Search for Modern China. So in his text, Jonathan Spence says, quote, "The Hundred Flowers campaign was not merely a simple plot by Mao to reveal the hidden rightists in his country. It was rather a muddled and inconclusive movement that grew out of conflicting attitudes with the CCP leadership." In either case, the Hundred Flowers campaign had a significant chilling effect on public discourse in China. This point going forward, people are going to be much less likely to offer constructive criticism of the government. And that is going to be very significant in the next event we're going to look at, which is the second 5-year plan, also known as the Great Leap Forward. With the second 5-year plan, Mao was greatly emboldened by how successful the first 5-year plan had been. Mao saw these voluntary collectivized farms as the beginning of unlocking even more potential from the Chinese masses. So Mao Zedong wanted to force every single Chinese worker onto massive collectivized farms to get even more gains from these 5-year plans. He wanted to surpass the United Kingdom's industrialization in 15 years. He wanted to leapfrog from that step of socialism to pure communism, as we saw in the previous slide. He wanted to destroy these little private plots of land that were causing farmers to make some money on the side and start to accumulate wealth. So he had a few different goals with this Great Leap Forward. The way that this worked was the Chinese Communist Party asked the giant collectivized farms to predict their grain agricultural output. Then the Chinese Communist Party would take food from the collectivized farms based upon the predictions, and the food would go to pay the workers in urban areas or on industrial projects, and it was also going to pay the Soviet Union for the debt that China incurred as a result of the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship. The posters here, I chose these because there's a lot of imagery during the Great Leap Forward about taking off like a rocket. So here we have sheaves of wheat, and here we have a man flying into space on a rocket, and here we have sheaves of wheat that are being launched into the sky like rockets. Here is a propaganda poster showing a collectivized farm, and I will provide a link in the description to this YouTube video so you can see a really high resolution image of this poster. What I'd like you to take note of is all of the different facilities that are here on this highly idealized collectivized farm. We have people farming in the background. It looks like they're harvesting cotton, as well as there are silos here that are overflowing with grain. In the foreground, we have a lot of different facilities being provided for the members of the collectivized farm. I'm sorry, the commune, the people's commune. Here we have a dining area. Over here we have the local security force. We have some children playing. We have some elderly care. We have a little shop where you can buy necessaries. We have some laundry being done. We have a radio broadcast facility. Then over here, we have a field of grain, and the grain is growing so thick that this person is having difficulty pushing themselves through the field of grain. And in the background, we have furnaces for making steel, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So by 1958, almost all of rural people had been organized onto these people's communes. So this is no longer voluntary. The government is telling you, you must live on a commune. Local officials, in their desperate attempt to impress the higher-ups, they were falling over one another to make high predictions about how much they could produce. No one wanted to lowball their predictions and or disappoint officials above them. What that meant was that the people's communes were left to starve. How did that happen? Well, take, for example, this scenario I've given. Local officials on the People's Commune claim they can grow 10 tons of grain. So the Communist Party says, all right, you guys are going to grow 10 tons. We'll take 8 tons. Then you'll be left with 2 tons. However, The local officials were overly ambitious, and the collective farm only grows 8 tons of grain. Then the officials come to collect and they say, hey, you said you were going to grow 10, so we're here to take our 8. The local officials, not wanting to disappoint, handed over the 8 tons of grain, leaving the local commune with not one grain of wheat or rice or whatever, millet. So the people there were left to starve. Now, here's my question to you. The reason that this happened was in part because of the 100 Flowers campaign and anti-rightist movement. So a question for you. How did the anti-rightist movement, led by Deng Xiaoping, called for by Mao Zedong, how did that contribute to this phenomenon of the people's communes starving? Give it some thought, and I'll show you the answer in 3, 2, 1. Well, after the 100 Flowers campaign, Mao Zedong called for the anti-rightist movement, and they rounded up the people that had criticized the government, and they made them, they humiliated them in public struggle sessions. They sent them to be re-educated, and some of them were killed. So people were fearful to speak out or oppose the government. And in particular, some of China's best and most trusted intellectuals had been publicly humiliated or sent to be re-educated. So we are left with a society where those with high education, those that are very good at critical thinking and offering constructive criticism, they have been scared into submission. And what we have left is a fearful populace who is just going to do what they're told because they are afraid of retribution. So in that climate of fear, some of the other programs that came along with the Great Leap Forward are also going to be very disastrous. Mao Zedong traveled through a part of China that had a history for steel production going way back to ancient times. The local inhabitants were able to craft steel using pretty primitive materials like man-made furnaces. So he saw that, and then Mao wanted to encourage these people's communes to all make their own steel so they could surpass the United Kingdom. But how did it play out? Well, it was an utter failure because the vast majority of people in China outside that one community didn't know how to make steel in their backyard. So what they ended up doing is a quota would be set for how much steel they were going to make, and people, out of fear, just began melting down any tools and metal equipment that they had. And they produced useless globs of melted fused metal that weren't good for anything. So useful farm implements and useful metal objects were melted into useless chunks of fused metal. People also spent a lot of time doing this, time that could be better spent doing more productive things. They spent time making the steel, and they spent time gathering coal or firewood to keep the furnaces going as much as they could. In one really gruesome anecdote, some communities were digging up people's graves in order to use the wooden coffins to keep the furnaces running. They destroyed tables, wooden tables, they took off wooden doors, and they used coffins to keep the furnaces going, to make useless steel. Another example was the 4 pests. Mosquitoes, flies, sparrows, and rats can be pests because they can spread disease or they can eat crops. The problem was that the people of China had been so effectively mobilized that they were wiping out these populations of critters. So let's take the sparrows, for example. Based on what you guys know from biology, if you completely wipe out one animal within a food chain, what happens? Well, what happens is that the prey that animal fed upon are going to flourish now. So in the case of sparrows, locusts and other insects that the sparrows had eaten could now flourish because they had no natural predators. So the 4 Pest campaign was extremely effective, but disastrous because it messed up the ecology. As a result of the Great Leap Forward, an estimated 30 million people died. There was also a massive drop off in the birth rate because people's bodies were not healthy enough to bring a child to term. So, whereas the first 5 year plan could largely be seen as a success, the second 5 year plan, the Great Leap Forward, was a catastrophic failure. In our next video, we'll talk about the fallout from the Great Leap Forward and go from there.